Hello, very beautiful community. Don't assume that Trump's Iran war is over, but do assume that it would have been lost. Either way, what we're going to do today is look at a few extracts from a piece by John Gray in the New Statesman, which they titled on the front page, How Trump Destroyed the American Empire, and above the piece they titled it The End of the American Empire, and Trump's war in Iran presages the destruction of US authority, not its renewal. Now, writers don't choose their titles, but that roughly represents what's in the piece. So what I've done is I've picked out the bits where John gives the bigger picture perspective, and I've taken away a lot of the particular discussion of Iran and the Hormuz Strait and so on. So that's what we're going to do. Now, John is not me. He is a public intellectual who is going to do different things to you than I do to you. And that's very important. And he has a style of his own in which he's been working for a long time, most famously since Straw Dogs came out in 2002. But actually, he's had a public intellectual style of his own since at least the early 90s. I mean, if you look at his collection Enlightenment's Wake, many of the essays there are non-academic public intellectual interventions. You might say, well, what's the difference? Well, that's itself up for debate, and different intellectuals and public intellectuals and intellectuals who are public intellectuals and public intellectuals who are not intellectuals. There are those to debate what the difference might be. But what I say cartoonishly is that an academic piece is about saying something that is significant and true on a good day. But a public intellectual intervention is about the reader's or the audience's relationship with truth, right? It's manipulation, hopefully of a constructive and ethical kind, of the audience's relationship with truthfulness. So in a certain sense, there's a difference of priority there. With the academic stuff, or the intellectual stuff, if you like, it's significant truths that come first. With public intellectual work, it's your relationship with significant truth that comes first, right? That I am trying to ethically manipulate. But let's look at John now, and we'll react as we go, and then we'll react at the end. With its proven capacity to wreak havoc on the world economy, a bombed-out military theocratic dictatorship has begun the final unraveling of US imperial power. Now, by the way, beautiful community, this is my microphone from the room next door, which took me 11.5 months to move here, because it's 11.5 months since I last stood. And I kept hoping I'd be able to make regular videos in the room next door, but that hasn't happened. And so finally, I gave in, and the mic has moved here, because for emotional reasons, I kept it over there. The fiasco that is unfolding is not the result of strategic error. In her magisterial study, The March of Folly, From Troy to Vietnam, 1984, the American historian Barbara Tuchman described how governments persistently pursue policies contrary to their own interests, even though better alternatives are available and known to them. Choosing spectacle over prudence, the Trojans brought the Greek wooden horse inside their walls. Overconfidence and extravagant spending by Renaissance popes fueled the Protestant Reformation. The stubborn pride of George III's government provoked rebellion and the loss of Britain's American colonies. A refusal to admit that the war was unwinnable produced a humiliating defeat in Vietnam. Hubris, self-deception, and corruption led inexorably to ruin. Now, these are very, very universal materials of political, life that Machiavelli and Thucydides both understood well. All these marks of folly are visible in Trump's Iran war. Trump's war is folly in precisely Tuchman's sense. Politically, it can only harm him. raising petrol prices at the pump and worsening his dwindling prospects in November's midterms. It flouts his campaign promises of no more forever wars and alienates him from the neo-isolationist America First wing of his fracturing MAGA base and strengthens the hand of his rival JD, disgraced, irresponsible political entrepreneur Vance. Sorry, that's my addition. Internationally, his expedition can only marginalize him, even if the European far right, Marine Le Pen, Meloni, AfD, are distancing themselves. Now, it's very important that what we're talking about here is okay to be called the far right, but more specifically, it's the post-right. These are ex-conservatives who have become authoritarians but remained in conservative clothes. That's a very important distinction to understand, because it teaches you both about the death of conservatism, but it also teaches you about the fact that there's a difference between a constitutional conservative and a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary who wants to smash democratic institutions. That's why folks like that I don't love calling far-right, but we're obviously talking about the same thing. Now, will these European folks by the 2030s ally with their US equivalents? And the answer is probably yes. In other words, the only thing that will prevent it is if there are direct inter-country threats, right? So if in the 2030s another Trump is, threatening the sovereignty of a European country, West European country, that's also got its own Trump, the micro-Trump will clash with the macro-Trump. But unless that happens, the tendency is for them to converge, because they're basically, absolutely sharing in the same ideological wash. If you want to understand more about that, go to the main channel and check out the video Trump's Not a Russian Asset, where I talk about what Trump indeed shares in common with Putin at the level of three kinds of ideological washes: monarchism, hyper-neoliberalism, it's kind of might is right ideology, and fascism. Okay, let's rock on. The cardinal consequence of the war will be the death of an idea of American empire. Now, do ideas die, by the way? Yeah, I mean, the way ideas die is that they typically retreat into the unconscious, or they become, even among their advocates, things that are only half believed and so on. So when we talk about cultural transformation, the transformation of belief in society and belief in society about the society, it's very important to understand that there's a great deal of double-mindedness always inside a single individual consciousness, right? When that individual consciousness is negotiating cultural transformation. Founded in the imagination as a city on a hill that left the empires of Europe behind, the founders of the United States ostensibly repudiated anything that smacked of imperial power. But by the time of the First World War, it had acquired several territories that functioned as colonies in a traditional European sense. Numerous small Caribbean and Pacific islands, Alaska, Hawaii, Philippines, Panama Canal Zone. It is this old world imperial order to which Trump aims to revert in his revival of the Monroe Doctrine, asserting America's hemispheric suzerainty. Now, Trump ain't reviving shit, of course, but you could functionally make the case that it's more plausible to think of the United States as a sphere of influence power going into the future. So Trump's advancing the trend in that direction functionally, if not ideologically. Trump doesn't have clear convictions about what's what in the world. In the 20th century, the idea of empire mutated with Woodrow Wilson's fervent promotion of national self-determination at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference. The projection of an American model of government became an anti-imperial project, professedly advancing the rights and aspirations of all peoples. Beneath the accidents of their historical identities, an ideal American was latent in every human being. Now, the reality is that I'm okay with you thinking of the United States as an empire or as not an empire. I call it an empire. But I don't think that we need to get bogged down in these distinctions. What matters is that the United States is a global power that is, deeply enmeshed in many societies across the globe, militarily, economically, politically, and it has sometimes projected power benignly and constructively. Perhaps in Bosnia in the 90s, in Ukraine more recently. It's also projected power unconstructively on many occasions, and you heard a couple mentioned above. And so we've got this situation where the United States is a kind of empire light, as Michael Ignatieff said 20 years ago. And it does lots of constructive and lots of destructive things. And yet certain global challenges are simply insoluble without the projection of US imperial power. And it's that power that's retreating now. Some version of this fanciful notion informs the catastrophe that is underway today. The notion that an American is latent in every human being. Relentless aerial bombardment does not release an imaginary inner American and unify populations against their governments, no matter how repressive they may be. Especially when civilian infrastructure is targeted, it unites them against the invader. When Trump posts he'll rain down hell on them, he expresses the same idea as the American commander who said of the Vietnamese city in 1965, it became necessary to destroy the town to save it. The sequel will not be dissimilar in Iran. I mean, Iranians are disposed to be favorable toward the United States, but not when the United States bombs them, roughly. Destroying to save is something against which we, of course, need prophylaxis in a post-truth age. And we do quite a bit of it on the channels. And I'm thinking one of the things we might do is look at George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, from 1946. We haven't talked about Orwell together in relation to our living in a post-truth culture. But Orwell had a great purity, which is unsurprising given his neurodiversity. He had a great purity about keeping oneself epistemically clean. And in many ways, there's a lot we can internalize from him, even if we're not autistic. This is not simply a case of the lessons of history being ignored. Trump's war looks more like an example of what Freud described as repetition compulsion, an unconscious process in which the mind acts out what it cannot properly remember. And I like that John is doing this. I like that John is saying that you've got to face the multidisciplinary challenge here. You've got to have some psychological explanation, right? You're not going to understand what's going on if you are some kind of analyst at a think tank who is used to, the basic moves in international relations, you're not going to get why Trump's doing what he's doing. Now, that Freudian idea is the idea that materials that get suppressed get lived out again and again. Right, so repressed material returns and is enacted. What I have been doing with some of the comments I've made about Trump is saying something that is compatible with certain traditions that have followed Freud, Kleinian and post-Kleinian traditions. And in their spirit, what I really want to say here is that what can't be emotionally contained is then evacuated into action and attack on the world. So what do we mean by this? We mean that Trump can't metabolize frustration. And he attacks reality that frustrates him. And he replaces thinking about reality with action. A creature of the moment, John says, which is very good of John to say, as he may be, Trump seems to be driven by an impulse to reimagine the past and reassert American and his own greatness. His own, no, actually, and American definitely no. So what's going on here? So this is just a little bit too systematic and too unself-centered for Trump. And this is interesting, right? John is the best public intellectual in the UK, and he is so instinctively close to getting this right because he's got a wonderful imagination. But unless you know narcissistic personality disorder really well, and unless you understand neurodiversity, which John doesn't, I imagine, you can't quite nail Trump. And so you end up, even if you're so imaginative and instinctively healthy like John is, you end up a little bit feeling your way around the room blind, and you can't turn the light on. So there's no such thing as American greatness for Trump. That cannot be a stable object for him. So nor is Trump's own greatness a stable object for him. What he is interested in is the perception of his greatness. He is interested in public affirmation of his greatness. But the idea of a picture of one's greatness of the kind that Putin has, toward which might be utterly delusional, but toward which one can systematically aspire, right? Putin might think of himself, amongst other things, as a gatherer of lands, so there he goes, gather some lands. All of that is completely impossible for Trump. Completely impossible. He has to feed his need for narcissistic supply. Positive narcissistic supply, various kinds of elevation and admiration, and negative kinds of narcissistic supply. The perception of Trump's destructive omnipotence, the recognition or trembling in the face of Trump's destructive omnipotence. That works. But Trump's not a guy who can even coherently pursue his own greatness, even in a delusional sense in which Putin is doing it. Now, John, even as he is taking a wrecking ball to the historic White House East Wing to construct a monumental ballroom that may never be built, he seems bent on demolishing a global order he has failed to remake in his image. And again, this is a bit too world-directed. And Trump is not engaged in world-making. He uses experiences he triggers out in the world as a means for self-regulation. They're not there to remake the world, right? And so again, we've got this situation where unless you grasp the dynamism of what's going on with Trump neurologically and psychologically, you're going to be, even if you're brilliant, really close, but not quite there. When an infantile fantasy of omnipotence, this is very good, comes up against unyielding realities, the response is inchoate rage. Very good. Psychopathology may be more illuminating than geopolitics at this point, which is, so John's really hitting the back of the net repeatedly now in this section. In a more profound sense than is commonly recognized, Donald Trump does not know what he's doing. No. Trump whisperers, such as NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte, believe they can inject a sliver of reason into his deliberations. And by the way, if you look at recent videos of Mark Rutte being asked, what do you think about Trump saying that he's going to obliterate a civilization? And Mark says, well, I don't comment on all statements leaders make, but I believe in the president's leadership. That's what civilizational decline looks like. When bad things are happening, things are getting worse, but the actors involved are comically unfit for the task. I already was mean to some of you months ago when I said that Rutte's approach was misguided, and I'm going to continue to be mean. The difference now is that before, about 70% of you agreed, now about 90% of you are going to agree. So the only circumstance under which you could justify Rutte's approach is in a world in which Trump was an aberration and you just needed to suck this up until a renormalization occurs, right? But everything that John's appropriately putting before us in this piece indicates that that ain't going to happen. So the thought that the United States can bounce back and renormalize after Trump back to something like 1998 is not a thought that a well-adjusted adult human should have. And yet that's the only condition under which Rutte's approach might be helpful. Now, there are many of you, of course, again, it's a minority, but it's a demographic worth adjusting to and engaging with, because I think all of us want to reach for that wishful thinking thought that, come on, surely democracy is about people deciding and people can just wake up tomorrow and decide against this. So what's missing from this is all social explanation, which actually decides what happens by and large, right? You're omitting from this the economic forces at hand, the cultural forces at hand, the technological forces at hand, the ideological / self-realization forces at hand that make people very difficult to mold into citizens who want to deal with values like the public good and solidarity. So these social forces are part of the social explanation about how we got here and why people like Trump are being elected. And so if you think that we can just wake up tomorrow and snap out of this, functionally, not at the level of your intent, but functionally, you're a supporter of the authoritarians, right? That's what your function is as a citizen. Because that's a level of magical thinking that makes you ineffective as a citizen who needs to oppose these forces while understanding what causes them, right? And so, but surely, Vlad, democratic decline can be reversed if we just wake up tomorrow and decide we've had enough, is a pro-Trump thought. It's not a pro-Trump at the level of your intent, right? You're not being a bad person who likes this orange wrecking ball. You hate the orange wrecking ball, but you're functionally aligning yourself as a citizen in a way that benefits these political forces that you hate. But Trump's logic is instinctual, not rational, and his lifting of sanctions on Russian oil has demonstrated he has visceral sympathy for Vladimir Putin's blend of tyranny and oligarchy. Again, close but not quite. Trump has no clear picture of a remotely accurate kind, at least, of what's going on in Russia. Trump has no clear picture of Putin's personality. Trump deals with a fantasy version of Putin, whom he welcomes into an imaginary society to which both Trump and Putin belong. And in that society, Trump bathes in Putin's glow. That's how he receives narcissistic supply. So again, this is too real-world driven a thought that Trump admires the kind of regime Putin runs. Détente with Russia will create many lucrative business opportunities. While NATO may linger on in name, the transatlantic alliance is operationally defunct. Very strong statement from John. It is a public intellectual statement and is meant to jolt you a little bit. Because again, one might be inclined to believe that Article 5 is a sort of patchy period. It might be restabilized 5 years from now. But the reality is that no, we're already at a peak of Article 5. It'll be weaker in 5 years than it is today. That's the trajectory. So while that's arguably a hyperbolic statement, John might think it's real, might not think it's hyperbolic. John's absolutely entitled to make it because it's important to sort of shake us into a clarity of vision about this, which doesn't mean you do what certain more radical political parties sometimes propose, which is give up on NATO. That doesn't make any sense. It's a bit like saying, my boat has a problem, it's got a couple of holes in it, we're taking on water, I'm just going to jump in the ocean. No, you've got some time, and so the idea is that you work on having another boat to get onto. That's not NATO, that comes after NATO and overlaps with NATO. NATO is not going to solve Western security problems in the medium term, right? That's clear. But it doesn't mean you take an anti-NATO position. The opposite. You try to keep the damn thing on the road in the water floating as long as possible. And you fix, some of the holes while others appear. You've just got to understand that it's not an effective and sustainable vehicle for the medium to long term. America is returning to its pre-1914 trajectory as a civilization separate from Europe. In the UK, the default position is to wait out the storm until sanity returns to Washington. And I might look buoyant now, but my health has given me very, very few windows, which is why by already a couple of weeks, the main channel video I wanted to make about this is delayed. But it'll just come when it comes. About what kinds of cognitive shifts European leaders need to make to be effective in dealing with the United States that is spiraling. In the UK, the default position, blah, 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 when Putin and Xi, why Putin and Xi should exhibit similar patience is not explained. Could there be a better time for them to act? Ramping up hybrid warfare in under-defended Europe will give Putin leverage in any peace deal in Ukraine. Putin is more committed to his war, by the way, than ever today, right? You may have seen videos of Yanis Varoufakis dancing in Moscow, and Yanis thinks that the Russians are ready to compromise. Yanis is mistaken. Moreover, we're going to start talking more about Putin's hybrid ways of conflicting with us in the West, and he'll lean more into those over the next couple of years. With Trump having shifted military assets from the Asia-Pacific to the Middle East and running down munitions, Xi may be able to absorb Taiwan without firing a shot. There has been talk of an Anglo-Gaullism in which the UK relies on itself and European allies for its security. So this is the idea descended from Charles de Gaulle, that you put an emphasis on sovereignty, military independence, and the capacity to act, right, without being completely dependent on stronger allies. Obviously, this presupposes much higher defense spending, and soon, but renewing Britain's defense capacity requires reindustrializing the economy, an enterprise that could take decades. Without an actionable plan, British Gaullism is an idle dream. Now, there's another paradox here, namely that the more European powers spend on the military, the more prepared they're going to be to face Putin's threat. But the less they're then going to spend on, very roughly speaking, the welfare state, which will increase distrust in institutions even more. And that will lead to pro-Putin political figures being elected in the West. And that's a paradox we can't get out of. We're stuck in it. And so the answer is you've got to have as much as possible a situation where we have the cake and eat it at the same time. So we've got to do some militarization, but we've also got to try to minimize the degree to which it comes at the expense of things that are required to avert further loss of trust. And that's a really difficult one. So we can be a bit stronger militarily, but how pointful is that if we're going to have pro-Russian leaders? We can be weaker militarily. We might anyway have pro-Russian leaders. We might be a drop less likely to. Well, you've got to try to, work on that by having as much of each as you can possibly muster, because we do need to do some militarization. Trump's little excursion is a point of no return in America's retreat as a global power. In what world could such an outlandish figure be president of the United States twice? Well, our world. The one our rulers made and then showed they did not comprehend when they dismissed him as a passing aberration. Now, John Gray likes to say that populism is blowback to the policies of central technocrats, which centrist technocrats do not grasp. And that's one way of thinking about populism that's completely compatible with the way I recommend, which is to think of it in terms of proximity of public discourse to private sentiment. How far is public discourse becoming like kitchen table talk? But what I would say is that some of the problem we've got is caused by policies and politics. It's caused by the sort of emaciated and minimally ambitious liberalism of the post-Cold War era. It's caused by the neoliberalism that has taken hold in Western centers of power since the 1970s, which is just the thought that you put a magical primacy on the market. But not all of the problems we face with democratic decline are a product of bad decisions we made. Many of them are just a product of social forces we don't control. We don't control technology. And one thing we've got going is a social media environment. These places are effectively public squares, which is absolutely parasitic upon any constructive democratic engagement or the sustenance of trust. Where are we? Trump may wreck everything he touches, but his standing as a world historical figure is beyond doubt. That's true. Might he be leading America toward another regime change foreshadowed in the toxic trickster Tucker Carlson and the smooth left populist Zoran Mamdani? They too belong to our world. Now, John is trying to focus you in on the kind of political animal that thrives. Why is it that Danny and Trump are thriving at the same time. He wants you to reflect on that. The reason I don't speak like that is that I make a distinction between exclusionary and inclusive populism. And so Zoran as an inclusive populist, whether you like him or not, whether you think he's going to be able to be effective in practice or not, he's an inclusive populist. He's not an exclusionary populist, and he's not an anti-institutional populist. So these are two key differences between Trump and Zoran. Now, what has John done here, basically, for us? For you, rather, because this is a public intellectual piece. He's sort of trying to shake you into a kind of an illusion that's going to make you more effective as citizens. Because he is culturing you, habituating you into grasping the tragic element in politics. And grasping the fact that there is no we in politics. It's just very different and conflictive human groupings in a carousel of complex political conflict, globally and domestically. And he's trying to guide you into the truth that we can't entirely control our political world. We can't even entirely control forces we ourselves unleash. And that's a very important activity. You guide citizens into understanding that the way they are stuck historically and the way they might empower themselves to change the reality they're in are connected. It's only if you have a realistic appreciation of the way in which you're stuck, in the way we are where we are historically, in which we are in a situation where various social forces are at hand. We can respond to in various ways, we can mitigate in various ways, but we can't make entirely go away. So it's only if you're realistic about the ways in which we are where we are that you're going to be able to act effectively as a citizen. And contrary to instinct, a kind of pre-political instinct, thinking we're not stuck at all, we can do whatever we like, that's actually, as I say, functionally and inadvertently an endorsement of Trumpism. What is missing from John's piece here, not because it's missing in his views, it's just not in this particular piece, is the way this is linked to domestic politics. And you know what I like to say, that it's because of democratic incapacity at home that we have calamitous or weak foreign policy. And of course, Trump's Iran war is an example of this, right? It's because the United States is experiencing democratic decline that Trump is elected, and it's because Trump is elected that he engages in his atrocious intervention in the Middle East. Now, something else that's missing here, but again is very much present in John's work elsewhere, is an emphasis on how it is not just ignorance and a destructive impulse that's got Trump elected, but that Trump is also there because various liberatory instincts in the citizenry got him there. It was in many ways an assertion of agency by citizens to vote for Trump, just a very unconstructive and damaging one. And what's important here, and this is where I maybe like to go further than John does, is the question, how do you turn these liberatory impulses in a more constructive direction, right? Towards more constructive modes of civic belonging, towards more constructive engagement with the value of solidarity, the value of patriotism. And I do think we have quite a bit of room for that, right? There is room for democratic regeneration. And we're going to talk about that properly. And I suppose one of the other things that comes up is a kind of question about what the distinction between realism and fatalism is. And some of you might feel that John's piece is a bit fatalistic, which I'm not feeling that it is. And I think that being realistic is being able to face the world as it is, not being caught up in various kinds of wishful thinking about it, and also not being caught up in various kinds of wishful thinking about what the world can become. Whereas fatalism is believing that there is no way to tell a truthful story about the future that is hopeful at the same time, right? So, for example, I believe that this is not even close. Of course, there's plenty of hopeful stories we can tell about our future. And we can even tell a global story about our future that is not easy, but is certainly hopeful. Still leaves a lot on the table that's good, that will be part of our lives, part of the lives of our societies, and even part of the lives of future generations that aren't here, certainly in the West. But there's also always a real possibility to make things better and to stop things from getting worse. So, for example, Trump was a very, very weak and easily beatable political candidate in 2024. It's because the Democrats failed to come up even with a lame and incoherent idea of some kind of national project that Trump won. If they came up with some kind of a basic notion of a national project, this is what we're going to do with America, Trump would have lost. And so that's a very important truth. It's just as important a truth as the truth that there's a degree of inevitability to democratic decline, right? And it's important to keep two things in mind about the way we're stuck, but also about the way we have the possibility to transform our politics. And one way of transforming our politics, of course, is understanding it better. And I'm very grateful for your endeavors to do that together with me. Lots of love and talk very soon.